Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keed. I'm Phil Dobbie. Now, economies have been slowing, and we've seen the consequences, not least in our choice of politicians and the rise to the far right. But what if growth stopped altogether? Or what if we realised it has to stop because there's only so many resources on the planet, something the Club of Rome has been arguing about since the late 60s. We'll look at a post-growth economy today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Well, Steve, this is another one from one of our listeners. Pieter Verhoeven suggests we look at steady-state economics and the post-growth economy. So the question is, what happens when growth does stop? I mean, I guess we can look at Japan, can't we? Because there's not been a lot of growth there since the mid-90s. And what has been the consequence of that? They've got a GDP per capita which is below the OECD average, and yet their education standards are much higher than average. But if you look at the OECD Better Life Index, their life satisfaction scores a 4 compared to, for example, 7 in the UK. Yes, in the UK. So they're not too happy in Japan. So is that because they don't have economic growth? And does that mean if we want to be happy, we need economic growth? Is it essential for our well-being?
No, well, in fact, the whole idea of the post-growth society is talking about a world in which our target for production is that we continue supporting the population we have without increasing the amount of resources we're using, and in fact trying to go backwards in the use of resources.
So that would mean a GDP growth of 0, wouldn't it?
Yes, that's the whole target of the post-growth movement, is to say that we should abandon the quest for economic growth. We've had too much economic growth. What we need to do is to redistribute and to slowly move to the point where the GDP, in terms of the amount of resources we drag out of the biosphere and the amount of waste we bump into it, and that when that's back in balance, and that would mean no growth.
But the reason for growth that's often touted is that it improves our living standards. Growth means more people are employed, they spend more, so we spend more, we actually have a better quality of life at the end of it. That's the reason given, isn't it?
Well, the real reason, and this again comes back to the energy thing, is we're consuming more energy to do the same things we used to do in the past, and we're using non-human energy to do that, and it gives us a great degree of comfort that didn't exist in the past. So I'm sure you don't. I'm sure you have an electric toothbrush.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it's so tiresome, isn't it? Brushing up and down, up and down, up and down.
I mean, you and I are old enough to do that with the kids. Must think we're ridiculous, but that's what's happened. We've replaced all these systems which used to be in human labor in some manual sense, with machines, which means they've got to use energy, and that actually does mean, if you had a choice between using the old manual toothbrush and an electric one, I know which one we'd both go for.
So you make an interesting point there, because I was going to make the point that actually, are we any better off, but we still have a better life, because because a lot of what's improved your life has been inventions. So I've got a bigger TV, a nicer car, I've got more gadgets that make my life that little bit more bearable, but I'm not necessarily earning any more than perhaps I in real terms than I was 10 or 20 years ago. It's just that innovation has moved forwards. But as you're pointing out, a lot of that innovation is very energy dependent. Some of it, of course, is using less energy to do things, though. For example, my car uses less energy than, because it's a Prius, uses less energy than a car 20 years ago would have done, for example.
Yeah, I mean, but the whole issue is, can you actually decouple? Can you continue to get increasing living standards with a constant use of energy? And this is one of the terms which is used regularly, and this is what they call decoupling. So you decouple GDP itself from energy consumption, and the target of the no growth movement. And I could be wrong on some of these points, so I haven't read enough of the literature, because I'm a bit of a skeptic, which I want to talk about in discussion. But their argument is to decouple GDP from energy growth, which has never happened in the past. Therefore, what you could have is a rising GDP with a constant amount of energy consumption, or you could have a constant GDP with a falling amount of energy consumption. And of course, given where we've got to, the latter has to be the target. And that is the vision they have, of having a constant level of GDP and then basically working to redistribute income rather than trying to increase the income and have a declining energy pressure upon the planet.
Right. So that means, let me give you an example to support that. Japan, for example, even though they are a low growth economy, they're still a fairly innovative economy. And I think that's because they spend money on education. There might be something to learn there. But they're working on plastic cars that are going to halve the weight of vehicles. They're calling it iron to polymer cars. And that's obviously good for the environment. Half the weight of cars, half the energy consumption. Well, not exactly an exact match, but certainly a lot less. It
is feasible. I mean, there are, because when you think about when you're using energy, then, for example, you could have the old-fashioned dark satanic mills that with the world of Smith, which were so bad that John Baptiste Say he gave up on his pilgrimage to go and visit Smith's birthplace in Edinburgh because he couldn't stand the pollution. And that was enormously wasteful use of energy. Now, of course, we have much more efficient power stations, so you can go in that direction.
But do we just drive twice as far in our plastic cars?
Pretty much. This is the trouble. I mean, whenever you have an increase in efficiency, you could therefore use less. But what tends to be the individual uses less, but collectively you use more because more people go on the roads and so on. And so the whole idea of being able to decouple GDP from energy consumption, I think it's got limited legs at all, and generally speaking, it's a fallacy.
Right, but if because we're trying to make sure we use energy efficiently and also put a ceiling on it, then we start to charge more for petrol, for example. Is one way we deal with it now. We could just add more to the cost of petrol and say, you're going to be the same as you were before because cars are half the weight. So we can put a ceiling on the consumption. Well, we can try and say, well, okay, it's more efficient, but we're going to stop you using it more. So the net benefit is a gain for us. We can do stuff like that through taxation and the like, can't we?
We can, and that's some of the ideas that are called in the no growth movement. But I think ultimately the real problem with the no growth movement alone, it's something I emotionally support because we have gone far too far in our damage to the planet already. We have to reverse direction, and the philosophical orientation of no growth is a definite improvement. What the whole thing, as you mentioned earlier on, the whole idea about growth is, it makes us all feel better, so we don't need to worry about the distribution of income. Now, of course, we do need to worry about the distribution of income. Yeah. And part of the no-growth movement is to say that we can actually the vast majority of us can get better off if we have a distribution of income from the wealthy towards the poor. And the trouble is that raises all the political hackles of human society. And
well, why is that? Why is that happening, though? Why? Because whether we are consciously saying, "Well, let's move to a low growth society" or not, we are moving to a low growth society. I suspect the only reason some economies are growing reasonably well. Well, look at Australia, for example. The only reason the Australian economy is growing is because the Chinese nation is growing so quickly, and the reason the Chinese nation is growing so quickly is because there's so many people there that are moving from a developing nation to a developed nation. So once everyone is a developed nation, I suspect, whether we like it or not, we're at a low growth or no growth economy, aren't we? And when that happens, we do see when growth slows, the rich poor gap widens. Why is that?
Oh, I'm not sure that is true, mate.
Oh, really? Okay.
I think it's more a power thing. It becomes more obvious in that situation, perhaps, because one thing that keeps you quiet, and this certainly happens in China, is that people are willing to shut up about the levels of inequality there and the levels of corruption because the average position is improving radically.
Right. They've got hope. They have hope, in other words.
They've got hope, yeah. If you lose the hope, then you stop you stop biting your tongue about that bastard down the road who managed to get his large block of land because of his partnership with the guy who's the communist mayor of your local town. So the political pressures become more obvious when you stop growing. And then in that situation, if you really do have the rapacious capitalist and rapacious bureaucrat side of politics applying, then they don't cease being rapacious when the growth stops. And it becomes much more obvious they're ripping off the rest of the people. So it becomes more sharpened when there's no growth, but it isn't enhanced.
Well,
by
a lot more
growth.
To this discussion on a no-growth economy. How do we get there? How do we stay there? And what are the consequences of it? If you want to hear it in full, then you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. Choose one of the subscription options in the right-hand side, or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. If you pledge $10 or more support to Steve's research work, then you get access to this and all the other 120 or so podcasts that we've already recorded in this series. So hopefully you'll do that. We'll see you back here for the full episode. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. We'll be back again soon. Thanks for listening.